Okay, so this is part 4 of our video lecture on 20th century modernism, and we're going to deal with modernism in architecture. Um, there are three major elements of modern or modernist architecture that emerged in the early 1900s. Two of them were new construction materials, and one of them was a new design element. So the new structural materials included structural steel and also ferroconcrete. Structural steel included usually steel beams. These were used to form the skeleton of a building. You can thank Andrew Carnegie and his U.S. Steel Company for this. After Carnegie harnessed the Bessemer process to the mass production of steel, he was able to make lightweight, flexible, and high quality steel available at unheard of low prices. And then ferroconcrete. Ferroconcrete is basically cement applied over a structure of steel bars or wires, also known as rebar, as you can see here, to give it the desired shape and also to increase tensile strength. And then the new design element was the cantilever. Steel and ferroconcrete in turn allowed for greater use of a new design element, the cantilever, which is basically a horizontal beam supported only at one end and projecting out well beyond the point of support. So this building on the right here is a good example of that. Right? You've basically got two square buildings stacked on top of each other, which in this case, this is a building made out of two shipping containers. But this is possible because the frame of the shipping containers is, of course, steel. One of the first modern architects to fully embrace the potential of these new materials and design elements was Frank Lloyd Wright, the American-born architect, probably the most famous architect of the 20th century, Frank Lloyd Wright. And one of my favorite stories about Frank Lloyd Wright comes from later in his life. In the 1950s, he was called into court to testify as a witness. During his testimony, he referred to himself as, quote, the greatest living architect in the world, or words to that effect. Afterward, his wife scolded him, saying that he should have been more modest, which the architect famously replied, "You forget, my dear, I was under oath." So obviously, Frank Lloyd Wright did not suffer from a dearth of confidence in his own abilities. Now, as arrogant as that might seem, it actually neatly sums up the position that Wright, whom many still regard as the greatest architect of the 20th century, holds within that discipline. Wright's basic design philosophy was something called organic architecture, which essentially promoted the construction of simply designed buildings that exuded harmony with their environments and that enhanced their surroundings rather than merely existing within them. Using these principles, Wright established his own style of architecture called the prairie style, which reflected the flat landscape of the American Midwest, called for long horizontal buildings with broad flat roofs and wide overhanging eaves using the cantilevered principle. A good example of this is Chicago's Roby House, a three-story terraced house with a wide cantilevered roof, overhanging terraces and verandas, and so on. And I'll include there'll be an extra video on the Roby House in the supplementary videos section. Another good example is Falling Water, also known as the Kaufman House at Bear Run, Pennsylvania, which was built in 1936. It uses ferroconcrete to create cantilevered terraces here and here and also here. cantilevered terraces built around a natural waterfall. It also uses natural stone to make it blend into its rocky and wooded surroundings. Um, Another school of architecture that flourished alongside Wright's prairie style would be the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus is a school of architecture and also applied art, what you might call applied art, founded by the German architect Walter Gropius. And by a school, I mean it was literally a school. The Bauhaus was literally a school. It was first located in the city of Weimar in Germany, then Dessau, and finally in Berlin. It was closed down by the Nazis in 1933 because its design principle violated the aesthetics of the First Reich, and also because, frankly, it included too many Jews. The basic principle espoused by the Bauhaus was that the formal design of an object, whether it be a house, a lamp, or a chair, should reflect its function. I'll repeat that again. The basic principle of the Bauhaus was that the formal design of an object, whether it be a house, a lamp, or a chair, should reflect its function. For that reason, they embraced the use of new synthetic materials like steel and ferroconcrete in architecture, also standardized and mass-produced parts with simple designs. In furniture, one of the most well-known things to come out of the Bauhaus is the cantilevered chair, something that probably all of you watching have sat in at some point or another. This is a cantilevered chair. It comes from the Bauhaus. In architecture, the best representation of the Bauhaus style is probably their headquarters in Dessau. A massive utilitarian structure built with structural steel, ferroconcrete, sheet glass windows. That's another major feature of the Bauhaus style, encasing almost the whole exterior. It represents a style of architecture also called the International style, which became associated with the Bauhaus. One prominent architect who borrowed liberally from Gropius's International style, but he wasn't formally associated with the Bauhaus per se, was Charles Edouard Jeanneret, more widely known by his nickname Le Corbusier, which, depending on what source you read, is either a modernized version of an ancestor's surname, or it may be a play on words, referring to corbeau, which is the French word for raven. And why would he be referred to by that nickname? Well, if you look at him, he had a very large protruding nose, which some people said reminded them of a raven's beak. As I said, Le Corbusier was never formally a member of the Bauhaus, but he did borrow many of their ideas, particularly their emphasis on efficiency of design, standardized construction materials to promote low-cost housing. He often argued that modern architecture should imitate the efficiency of modern industrial machines. He once declared that the house is a machine for living in. The house is a machine for living in. A good example of Le Corbusier's work would be Via Savoye in Poissy, France. This private residence is located just outside of Paris, and it's one of Le Corbusier's most famous structures. The main layer of the house is the second layer, which is basically a square block of ferroconcrete supported by pilotis or pillars. The first layer is a narrower concrete column that is used partly as support and partly as an entryway. The narrow band of windows on the second floor provides an abundance of natural light. Le Corbusier's influence can still be seen today, particularly in the use of modern uh, high-rise apartment buildings. Corbusier was one of the first architects to build them. Um, and then we come to 20th century modernism in music. The modernist assault on tradition can also be seen in early 20th century music, where a number of influential composers produced work that stridently rejected a number of key musical conventions that characterized Western music almost from the very beginning. One of those conventions, tonality. Before the turn of the century, almost all Western music was tonal in the sense of being structured around a single key or tonal center. In the early 20th century, however, a number of composers began deliberately creating music that was polytonal. In other words, having several tonal centers or atonal in the sense of not having any tonal center at all. Likewise, a number of modern composers created music that was deliberately polyrhythmic, having two or more different meters at the same time, or it might have no metrical pattern at all. Um, Furthermore, a number of modernist composers deliberately experimented with dissonance, i.e., the lack of harmony between musical notes. The effect could be jarring or even unpleasant for some audiences, but in many cases, that's what modernist composers were after. They were not trying to please their audience's ears so much as shock their audience out of their comfort zone. And lastly, a number of modernist composers experimented with different sources of sound, different sources of sound. This, uh, or in literally different sources of instruments. Um, Instead of using standard instruments like violins, cellos, French horns, etc., they often incorporated sounds from other sources like bullhorns, and doorbells, and police sirens. A good example of this new trend in music is the Austrian composer Arnold Schoenberg. Although heavily influenced by music from the classical and romantic traditions, in the early 1900s, Schoenberg began developing a new musical language that violated most of the time honored traditions of Western music. Instead of organizing his compositions around a home key, i.e., the tonal center, he treated every note the same. His works also utilized abrupt changes in rhythm, tonal color, i.e., timbre, and dynamics, i.e., the variation of the loudness between notes. And I'll play you a selection from Schoenberg's work, or I'll include rather a selection from Schoenberg's work in the supplementary video section, so you can see what I'm talking about. In a similar vein is Igor Stravinsky's famous ballet, The Rite of Spring, which was so unorthodox that it actually provoked a riot the first time it was performed in Paris in 1913. And a good example of why this was so, you can watch the accompanying video selection from the ballet Rite of Spring. I would urge you to watch the first 3.5 minutes of the video from Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. All right, that's it for Modernism Part 2.